The air in the courtroom felt different from the air outside. It was cooler, for one thing, conditioned and filtered until it tasted like nothing at all. It carried other smells, though. The faint, dry scent of old paper from stacks of files, the sharp hint of polish on the dark wood, and a metallic whisper that clung to the edges of the room, a remnant of so much anxious sweat over so many years. It was a smell of authority, of decisions, of consequences. At the front of the room, elevated on a platform like a ship's captain, sat the judge. She was a woman in her late 40s, with dark hair styled so precisely that not a single strand dared to move out of place. Her black robe was immaculate, a stark contrast to the deep red wood of the massive desk before her. People who didn't know her might have thought she looked calm, even a little bored. But the lawyers in the room knew better. They saw the stillness in her posture, the way her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was known for running her courtroom with a quiet, unshakable control. She didn't need to be loud. Her silence was often more powerful than any gavel. The case she was hearing that morning was a long one. It was a fight between two giant companies, tangled mess of numbers and dates that meant very little to anyone but the people getting paid to untangle it. The lawyers, a man and a woman, moved with the slow, heavy steps of people who had been living inside this mess for months. They shuffled papers, clicked pens, and spoke in voices that were serious but tired. There was no drama here, no crying witness or shocking confession. It was all about paragraphs in a contract, about a meeting that happened 3 years ago on a Tuesday. To the few people sitting in the public gallery, it was mind-numbingly dull. Sitting near the back, a boy was watching. He didn't look like he belonged. The few others in the gallery were either law students with serious expressions or a reporter, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The boy, maybe 15 or 16, was a splash of messy color in a world of gray and black. He wore a faded gray hoodie, the kind of soft, worn-out cotton that has been washed 100 times. On his feet were a pair of sneakers that had seen better days, their white rubber scuffed and dirty. He had his knees pulled up close to his chest, his arms wrapped around them, making himself small in the hard wooden bench. He wasn't listening to the lawyers. Their words about mergers and liabilities were just noise. A low hum like the air conditioning unit hidden somewhere in the ceiling. His focus was entirely on the woman behind the big desk, on the judge. He watched the way she tapped a single finger on her desk when she was thinking a slow, rhythmic beat. He noticed the small, almost invisible lines at the corners of her eyes. He watched her pick up a pen and write something on a legal pad. Her handwriting neat and sharp, just like everything else about her. To the room, she was Judge Vance. To him, she was a ghost. He had a picture of her tucked away in his wallet. It was an old photograph, folded and worn soft at the creases. It showed a much younger woman, smiling a little sadly, her hair less perfect. Her eyes full of a complicated mix of fear and hope. It had taken him months of searching, of late nights staring at a glowing computer screen. To connect that woman in the photo to the woman on the bench, he had traced old records, followed digital breadcrumbs. And finally, a week ago, he had found it, the public docket for Judge Vance's courtroom. He had seen her name, and he had known he had to come. Every time the courtroom door opened, a little knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He was terrified of being noticed, of being told to leave. But he was even more terrified of not going through with it. His heart was beating so hard he was sure the people sitting in front of him could hear it. A frantic, clumsy drum against the steady, formal rhythm of the court. He could feel a thin film of sweat on his palms, and he wiped them discreetly on his jeans. His throat felt dry and tight. This was the closest he had ever been to her. For his entire life, she had been a secret, a question mark at the beginning of his story. Now she was just 50 feet away, a living, breathing person who held all the answers, the lawyer who was speaking. A man with a very expensive suit and a voice that slid over everything like oil was suddenly having trouble. He stopped, frowned, and started shuffling through a thick stack of papers on his table. The papers were held together with a bulky metal clip, and they looked messy and disorganized. A stark contrast to the judge's tidy desk, Your Honor, the lawyer said, his voice losing its smooth confidence for a moment. I apologize. It seems we are missing a critical exhibit, a document that should be in this pile. He looked over at his assistant, who looked just as flustered, whispering something and frantically searching a briefcase. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. I would like to request a brief recess, 15 minutes, to locate the document. A quiet ripple of relief went through the courtroom. Even the judge seemed to let out a tiny, almost silent breath. She looked at the clock on the wall, then back at the flustered lawyer. She didn't look angry, just a little weary, as if this was just one more delay in a very long day. Granted, she said. Her voice was clear and clipped, cutting through the low murmur that had started in the room. 15 minutes. She picked up her wooden gavel and brought it down once. The sound was sharp and final, echoing in the sudden silence. That was the sound. It was the signal he had been waiting for. The tension in the room broke. People started to talk in low voices. The lawyers packed up their files, their faces showing a mixture of frustration and relief. The judge stood up from her high chair. But instead of walking through the small door behind her that led to her private chambers, she stepped down to the side. She moved to the clerk's desk, a long raised table that sat just below the bench. It was a common thing to do during a short break, a chance to look over a file without leaving the room. She leaned over the table, her back now partially turned to the courtroom. Her attention focused on a thick file the clerk had pushed toward her. This was it. The moment he had pictured in his mind 1,000 times. The boy's breath caught in his throat. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, felt suddenly cold and then hot. He saw his chance, a small window of time where she was close but distracted. The entire world seemed to shrink down to just him and the woman leaning over that table. The 15 minutes had started. His 15 minutes, he could feel the worn-out photograph in his wallet, a secret pressing against his leg, reminding him of why he was here. He took a deep, shaky breath and pushed himself up from the hard wooden bench. The scrape of the chair's legs against the floor was louder than he expected, a small, rude sound in the quiet room. Asterisk, the sound of the chair scraping against the floor was like a sharp note in a quiet song. It was wrong. It didn't belong. Every head that was bowed in quiet conversation or buried in a file lifted and turned. All eyes fell on the boy in the faded hoodie. He was standing now, his body rigid, a solitary figure in the middle of the long wooden bench. For a second, he was just a strange interruption. It's an awkward teenager who didn't know court etiquette, a uniformed bailiff. A man with a kind face but a powerful build started to move toward him. His steps were calm and measured. "Son, you need to remain seated," he said in a low, gentle voice. "You can't stand up during a recess." He thought it was just a kid who didn't understand the rules, someone who was bored and restless. He was about to put a reassuring but firm hand on the boy's shoulder, but the boy didn't even seem to see him. His eyes were locked on the woman at the clerk's desk. He took a step forward, then another, leaving the safety of the public gallery and stepping down into the well of the court. This was the sacred space where the lawyers worked, the area closest to the judge. It was a line you didn't cross without being invited. The air there felt different, heavier. It was the space where decisions were made. "Asterisk, sir," the bailiff said, his voice a little sharper now, a hint of warning in it. "I need you to stop." The boy kept walking. He had 3 more steps to go. 3 more steps before he would be right in front of her. The murmuring in the room had completely stopped. It was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. The lawyers froze, a file half open in one hand. The reporter in the back row stopped scribbling in his notebook, his pen hovering over the page. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what this strange, sudden drama was all about. Asterisk, the woman at the table, Judge Vance, heard the bailiff's voice. She sighed, a quiet sound of deep annoyance. She didn't look up yet. Her focus was on the document in front of her, a complex chart of numbers that she needed to understand before the court resumed. Interruptions were a waste of her time. An unscheduled interruption in her courtroom was a personal offense. She slowly raised her head, her face a mask of cold, professional anger. Her eyes found the boy, then the bailiff who was now moving to intercept him? Judge Vance held up a single, elegant hand. The gesture was small, but it was more powerful than a shout. The bailiff stopped in his tracks instantly. The entire courtroom waited for her to speak. Her authority was absolute. She looked at the boy, her gaze like ice. He was so close now, she could see the flecks of lighter color in his dark eyes, could see the nervous twitch in his jaw. "Young man," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It was the kind of voice that made you want to shrink, to apologize, to disappear. "You are on the verge of being held in contempt of this court. You are trespassing in the well. You are disrupting a judicial proceeding. You have exactly 1 second to explain this obscene display before I have you removed." The boy flinched at her words, but he didn't back away. He stood his ground, his whole body trembling, but his feet planted firmly on the polished floor. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. He swallowed hard, his throat feeling like it was full of sand. He had practiced this moment in his head so many times, but now, faced with her cold fury, the words felt stuck. He saw not the woman from the faded photograph, but a powerful stranger who could have him locked up. He took a shaky breath and forced the words out, his voice cracking with the effort. "My name is Finn Miller." The name meant nothing to her in this context. She had heard hundreds of names in her career, faces and facts that she processed and filed away. She searched her memory for the name Miller in connection to the current corporate suit, but came up with nothing. It was just another name. "I do not know you, Mr. Miller," she said flatly, her eyes narrowing. Her patience was gone completely. If he didn't say something of substance in the next 5 seconds, she would nod to the bailiff. This was over. "Yes, you do," Finn said, his voice a little stronger now, fueled by a sudden surge of desperation. He felt a hot tear escape from the corner of his eye and trace a path down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He couldn't. He needed every ounce of his courage. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not recognition, but a deeper confusion. He was just a kid. Why was a kid doing this? He had to say it. He had to say the one thing that would break through her wall. He had to use the code he had spent years uncovering. He took another breath, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it hurt. "Case file J882, he said. The numbers hung in the air, meaningless to everyone else in the room. But he saw it. He saw the change in her face. The professional mask didn't exactly fall off, but a crack appeared, a hairline fracture right across her composure. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale. Her perfectly still posture tightened, her spine becoming even straighter if that were possible. She knew those numbers. He knew she knew. It was the file number she had forced herself to forget for the last 10 years. He pressed on, his voice gaining momentum as he saw her reaction. From 10 years ago? In the county family court. It wasn't here. It was in the old building. He was giving her details, pieces of the puzzle that only she would know. Finalization of an adoption for a baby boy. A boy who was just a few weeks old. The judge could no longer hold his gaze. Her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second.
Ow.
Looking at the polished wood of the clerk's table as if she could see through it to the past. The bailiff looked from the boy to the judge, his expression one of complete confusion. He had no idea what was happening, but he could see that this was not a simple case of a disruptive teenager. This was something else entirely, something deeply personal and profoundly wrong. Finn's voice dropped to a near whisper. But in the dead silence of the courtroom, every single person heard him as if he were standing right next to them. His last words were the ones he had been holding back his entire life. "The file says the birth mother's name is redacted. It is, in the official copy. But I know the name. It's not a secret anymore." He paused, letting the weight of his statement press down on the woman before him. He looked at her not with anger, but with a deep, heartbreaking plea. He was just a boy looking for the beginning of his own story. Then he said the final words. The ones that would change everything. The name is Eleanor Vance, Collective. Almost inaudible gasp seemed to suck the air out of the room. The lawyers stared, their mouths slightly open. The reporter's pen fell from his hand and clattered onto the floor. No one moved. No one spoke. The judge, Eleanor Vance, stood frozen, her hand still resting on the edge of the clerk's table. She stared at the boy, Finn, her face a battlefield of emotions she could no longer control. Shock, fear, a dawning horror. And beneath it all, something that looked painfully like grief. The secret she had buried so deeply, so carefully, for 15 years was no longer a secret. It was standing in front of her, in a worn-out hoodie, with tears on its face, calling her by her name. The formidable, unshakable judge was gone. In her place was a woman who had just been confronted by her own past. A past that had suddenly grown a voice and walked right into her courtroom. And there was no gavel, no rule of law, no legal precedent that could protect her from it. Asterisk, the silence that followed Finn's final words was not an empty silence. It was a heavy, pressing thing, thick with shock and disbelief. It was the kind of silence that feels loud, that fills your ears with a ringing sound. The air itself seemed to have solidified, trapping everyone in the room in a single, frozen moment. The bailiff stood perfectly still, his hand resting near his belt, his mind trying and failing to process what he had just heard. The two corporate lawyers, who had been fighting tooth and nail over millions of dollars just minutes ago, now looked like children who had stumbled into a private, painful world they were never meant to see. Their complex case, their careers, their mourning it, all seemed to evaporate into insignificance. The reporter in the back had forgotten all about his story. This was not a story. This was something raw and real, a tragedy playing out in real time. And he felt like an intruder. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Vance. Her face, which had been a canvas of controlled authority, was now a mess of conflicting emotions. The blood had drained from it, leaving her skin a pale, chalky white. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she were about to say something, but no words would come. Her eyes, which had been so sharp and analytical just moments before, were wide with a vulnerability that no one in this room had ever seen. They were fixed on Finn, but it was as if she were looking through him, into a past she had fought so hard to lock away. For 10 long seconds, she didn't move. It felt like 10 years. Then, a slow tremor started in her hand. It was the hand she had rested on the clerk's table. Now it began to shake, a tiny, uncontrollable tremor that she tried to stop by clenching it into a fist. But the tremor won. It spread up her arm. She felt a coldness wash over her, a deep, bone-chilling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was the cold of a secret exposed to the light after a lifetime in the dark. She finally tore her gaze away from the boy's face and looked around the room, as if seeing it for the first time. She saw the shocked faces, the wide eyes, the open mouths. And in their eyes, she saw her own undoing. She was Judge Eleanor Vance, the embodiment of order and control. And in a few simple words, a child had shattered that image completely. Her composure returned. Not as a calm wave, but as a brittle, fractured shield. The professional in her fought its way to the surface, grasping for control like a drowning person grasping for a rope. Her voice, when it finally came, was thin and strained. But it was the voice of a judge. It cut through the oppressive silence. Court is in recess. Her words hung in the air. They were not a suggestion. They were a command issued with the last ounce of her authority. She pointed a trembling finger toward the exit, a gesture that was both regal and desperate. Clear the courtroom. Everyone now. Her voice cracked on the last word, but the urgency in it was undeniable. The spell was broken. People began to move slowly at first, then with a nervous, shuffling haste. No one wanted to be there anymore. They gathered their things, their movements clumsy and awkward. They avoided looking at the judge or the boy, their eyes fixed on the door as if it were the only safe place in the world. The bailiff, his face a mask of solemn duty, began to guide people out, his voice low and respectful. Everyone, please exit in an orderly fashion. The court is in recess. Finn didn't move. He stood his ground, his eyes still locked on Eleanor. He was the cause of this chaos, but he was also the reason for it. He couldn't leave, not now. He watched as the last person, The reporter finally filed out, and the heavy wooden door swung shut, closing them in. The click of the latch was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Now they were alone. Well, almost. The bailiff stood by the door, a silent, unmoving guardian. The courtroom felt cavernous and empty without the crowd. The quiet was different now. It was no longer a shocked silence, but a private, aching one. To Eleanor stood for another moment, her back still mostly to Finn. She was breathing in short, sharp gasps, as if she had just run a great distance. She placed her other hand on the table to steady herself, both fists clenched tight. She could feel Finn's eyes on her back. She could feel his presence, a living, breathing accusation. The boy was no longer a ghost from a faded photograph. He was here. He was real. She turned around slowly, and for the first time she truly looked at him. Not as an intruder, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person. She took in his worn-out hoodie, his nervous posture, the tear tracks still drying on his face. She saw the fear in his eyes, but she also saw something else. A steely resolve, a desperate hope. He was just a boy, but he had the strength of an army. She looked at the bailiff. "Please, escort him to my chambers." Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile and hoarse. She couldn't bring herself to say the boy's name. The bailiff nodded, his expression one of deep sympathy. He approached Finn gently. "Son, please come with me." He didn't touch him, just gestured toward the small, unmarked door behind the judge's bench. Finn hesitated for a second, looking from the bailiff's kind face to the judge's pale, stricken one. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and started to walk. The walk to her chambers felt like the longest walk of his life. He was leaving the public space of the courtroom and entering her private world. The bailiff opened the door and held it for him. Finn stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind him. Her chambers were not what he expected. He had imagined something cold and intimidating like the courtroom, but it was just an office. A nice office, to be sure. There were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with law books, their leather spines gleaming under the soft light of a desk lamp. A large window overlooked the city, but the blinds were mostly closed, slanting the sunlight into thin stripes across the carpet. The air smelled of old books, fresh coffee, and a faint, clean scent like lemons. There was a personal touch here and there, framed photograph of a mountain range on a corner of her desk, a delicate hand-painted vase on a shelf. It was a room that spoke of a quiet, ordered life, and he had just broken it. Eleanor entered a moment later, shutting the door firmly behind her. She didn't look at him. She walked straight to her desk and sank into her backed leather chair, as if her legs could no longer hold her. She stared down at the polished wood of her desk, at the neat stacks of paper, at the expensive pen lying perfectly parallel to the legal pad. These were her anchors, the things that defined her, but they felt useless now. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finn stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, not sure if he should sit, not sure if he was even allowed to sit. The silence stretched on, filled with everything they couldn't say. Eleanor was the one to finally break it, but she didn't look at him. She spoke to the desk. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was flat, empty of all emotion. It was a question, but it sounded more like an accusation. After all this time, why now? Why here? Finn took a shaky breath. His mouth was dry. "I didn't know how else to get to you," he said, his voice small in the large, quiet room. "I wrote letters. I sent emails. I called your office. They never got through. I was always just filtered out." She finally looked up at him, her eyes burning with a pain so deep it took his breath away. "I wasn't the one filtering you out," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know." She shook her head slowly, a gesture of disbelief. "I never thought. I never imagined." "You didn't want to imagine?" Finn finished for her. There was no anger in his voice, just a sad, simple truth. Her professional mask was gone completely now. She wasn't a judge. She was just a woman sitting in her office, her entire life crumbling around her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she wasn't seeing a disruption or a threat. She was seeing a boy who had her eyes. She saw the shape of his face, the line of his jaw. She saw pieces of herself in him, pieces of a younger woman she had long since buried. She motioned to a leather chair in front of her desk. "Sit down, Finn." He slowly moved to the chair and sat down, perching on the edge as if ready to flee at any second. He couldn't relax. Every nerve in his body was on fire. "Where are your parents?" she asked. The people who raised you? They're good people," Finn said quickly, a surge of loyalty rising in his chest. "They're amazing. They love me. They gave me everything. A home, a family. They're my mom and dad. This isn't about them. I didn't tell them I was coming. They don't know about this." A flicker of something relief? Guilt crossed her face. "I'm glad," she whispered. "I would never want to cause them any pain. They deserve to be happy," Finn said, his voice firm. "And I was happy. Mostly, but there was always a piece missing. A hole. You don't know what it's like to not know where you come from. To have your story start on page 2. He looked down at his hands, which were clenched together in his lap. "I just wanted to know. Not to change anything. Just to know." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window, to the slivers of sunlight. She could feel the walls she had built around her heart for 15 years starting to crumble, turning to dust. She remembered being a scared, overwhelmed girl, holding a tiny blanketed bundle in a sterile hospital room. She remembered making a choice she believed was the only one she could make, a choice born out of love and terror. She had told herself it was for the best. She had built a whole life on that foundation. But looking at the boy in front of her, the living, breathing result of that choice, she felt the full, crushing weight of her regret. "Your father," she began, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her. He didn't want to be a part of it. He was gone before I even knew for sure." Finn just nodded. He already knew that part. The file had been thin, but it had told him that much. "I was so young." "Gosh," she continued, her eyes still on the window as if she were talking to herself. "I was in law school. My whole life was ahead of me. I had a plan. And you were not part of the plan." She finally turned back to him, and her eyes were filled with tears. "I told myself I was giving you a better life. A life with 2 parents who were ready, who wanted you with their whole hearts. I told myself I was giving you a gift. But I think I was just saving myself." The tears spilled over and ran down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, just as Finn had let his fall in the courtroom. In this quiet office behind the closed door, there was no judge and no intruder. There was only a mother and a son, finally seeing each other for the first time. The secret was out. And now, the hard part was just beginning. The tears on Eleanor's face felt like a confession. They were an admission of a weakness she had spent half her life hiding, a vulnerability she had armored herself against with robes and gavels in a relentless pursuit of order. Now, in the quiet of her own office, that armor lay in pieces at her feet. She wasn't crying loudly. They were silent, steady tears that traced clean paths through her makeup and fell onto the dark wood of her desk, leaving tiny dark spots that spread like ripples in a pond. Each drop seemed to carry years of unspoken grief, of a sorrow so deep it had become a part of her. Finn watched her, and the anger he thought he might feel, the righteous fury of a boy abandoned, never came. All he felt was a profound, aching sadness. He saw not a powerful judge who had wronged him, but a woman who was profoundly lost. He saw the pain she had carried, the heavy, invisible burden that had shaped her into the person she was today. He had come here seeking answers, a key to his own identity. He hadn't expected to find her so broken. He didn't know what to do. Should he say something? Should he offer her a tissue? He felt a strange, powerful urge to comfort her, but he didn't know how. He was the source of her pain, the ghost made real. Anything he said felt like it would be clumsy, like it would only make things worse. So he just sat there, a silent witness to her grief, giving her the space she had never given herself. After a few minutes, the flow of tears slowed. Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath. The kind of breath you take after you've been underwater for too long. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small packet of tissues, wiping her face with a quiet, methodical precision that was so her, even in her despair. She didn't try to hide that she had been crying. The pretense was over. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice hoarse and raw. She wasn't looking at him, but at the tissue in her hand. I never let myself do that." Finn just shook his head. "You don't have to be sorry." Asterisk, she finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed, but clear. There was a new expression in them, a kind of dawning understanding. She saw him not as a disruption to her life, but as a person whose life she had disrupted. "You've been carrying this, haven't you?" she asked softly. "This whole, all this time?" "Yeah," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not that my parents didn't love me enough. They did. They filled my life with so much good. But it's like, if you're building a house and you have everything you need, bricks and wood and windows, but you don't have a foundation, you can still live in the house, but you always feel like it could just fall away at any moment because you don't know what's underneath." His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. A foundation. She had ripped away his foundation, and in doing so, she had built her own life on the same empty ground, on the memory of that missing piece. She had thought she was building something solid, a career, a reputation, a life of control. But now she saw it for what it was, a beautiful, impressive structure built over a sinkhole. And Finn had just stepped into the room and the ground had given way. "What are they like?" Eleanor asked, her voice genuinely curious. "Your parents, the ones who raised you." Small, genuine smile touched Finn's lips for the first time. "My dad, he's a high school history teacher. He's kind of goofy. He wears these terrible sweaters and tells dad jokes that make everyone groan. But he can talk about the Civil War like he was there. He made me love stories, you know? Not just the ones in books, but the stories behind everything." He paused, lost in the memory for a moment. "And my mom, she's a nurse. She's the strongest person I know. She's gentle, but tough. She works long hours, but she never, ever made me feel like I was an afterthought. She can tell when I'm upset before I even say anything. She'd just bring me a cup of hot chocolate, and we'd sit on the couch and not talk, and I'd always feel better." He looked down at his hands. "They gave me a foundation, a really good one. That's why this is so hard. It feels like I'm betraying them by being here." "You're not," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Finding out where you come from doesn't mean you don't belong where you are. It just adds a new room to the house." He nodded, grateful for her understanding. "How about you?" He asked the question, feeling both terrifying and necessary. "What's your story? After me?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. She looked around the office, as if the answer was written on the spines of her law books. "I threw myself into school," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I studied like my life depended on it. Because in a way it did. If I could be the best, if I could be at the top of my class, maybe I could prove that I made the right choice. That giving you away was a sacrifice for a greater good. That I wasn't just a scared kid who couldn't handle it." She stood up and walked over to the window, parting the blinds slightly to look out at the city below. "I became a lawyer. I worked my way up. I became a prosecutor. Then a judge. I built a life that had no room for the past. No room for mistakes. No room for feelings." She turned back to face him. "I was successful. People respected me. I was fair. I was tough. I thought I was happy. But I never really let anyone get close. Not really. It's easier to be lonely when you're busy." Finn could see it all so clearly. The coldness in the courtroom wasn't just professionalism. It was a defense mechanism. The perfectly ordered office wasn't just tidy. It was a fortress. She had walled herself off so completely that she had trapped herself inside. She was the queen of a kingdom with only one subject, herself. "Did you ever think about me?" Finn asked the question, hanging in the air between them, fragile and heavy. "Every day," she answered, without a moment's hesitation. The words were so simple, but they carried the weight of 15 years. Not in a way that let me do anything. It was more like a background hum, a constant low-frequency ache. I'd see a boy who looked like he might be your age playing in a park, and my heart would stop for a second. I'd hear a child laugh, and I'd wonder what your laugh sounded like. I'd lie awake at night and try to picture your face, but it was always blurry, just a baby's face that faded over the years. She walked back to her desk and picked up a framed photograph of the mountain range. I started hiking. I'd climb mountains alone. I told myself it was for the challenge, for the quiet. But I think I was just trying to get closer to the sky, trying to feel something bigger than myself, something that didn't hurt so much. She placed the photo back down, her movements slow and deliberate. The day I became a judge, I felt this immense sense of pride, and this immense sense of terror. I was being given the power to make life-altering decisions for other people. And all I could think was, who am I to judge anyone's choices when I made a choice that defined my entire life, and I'm still not sure if it was right? She looked at Finn, her eyes pleading for him to understand. So I became more rigid, more by the book. If I followed the law to the letter, I didn't have to rely on my own broken moral compass. I didn't have to think about you. Finn felt a lump form in his throat. He saw the tragedy of her life with a stark clarity. In trying to escape the pain of her past, she had built a prison for herself. And she was the only prisoner. All that success, all that respect, it was all just gilded bars on a very lonely cell. I'm not mad at you, Finn said, his voice clear and strong. For giving me up? I think I understand it. You were a kid. You were scared. You did what you thought was best. A fresh wave of tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but this time they were different. They weren't tears of grief or regret. They were tears of relief, of a burden she didn't know she was carrying being lifted just a little. She had braced herself for his anger, for his hatred. She had prepared herself for accusations, for blame. She had never prepared herself for his forgiveness. I think about the file number, he said softly. J882. I knew that if I said it, you'd know I was telling the truth. That I wasn't just some crazy kid. I spent months looking for it. I felt like a detective. It was the one thing that connected us. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. The file was sealed, she said, a puzzled frown on her face. How did you get the number? My dad helped, Finn explained. Not with the secret part. He doesn't know. But I told him I was doing a school project on how the legal system works, on how records are kept. He's a history teacher, so he loves that stuff. He found some old archived public indexes from the family court. He thought it was just a random case I was using for an example. He printed it for me, and there it was. Your name, next to the file number, listed as the petitioner. The actual file was sealed, but the index. That was public? He shook his head in wonder. It was just luck. A stupid, incredible accident. Eleanor sank back into her chair, the revelation washing over her. All her careful work, all the legal barriers she had counted on to protect her secret, undone by a school project and a dusty old index. It felt almost poetic. The universe, it seemed, had a plan of its own. She looked at the clock on her wall. The 15-minute recess had long since passed. The corporate lawyers would be waiting. The world outside her office door was continuing to turn, oblivious to the earthquake that had just happened inside. What happens now? Finn asked, echoing her thoughts. The question was simple, but it was the most complicated question in the world. What happens now? She was a judge. He was the son she had given away. Her professional life and her personal life had just collided in the most public and catastrophic way possible. She had responsibilities. She had a reputation. She had a life carefully constructed that was now lying in ruins around her. She looked at the boy sitting in front of her. He was no longer an abstraction, a what-if. He was real, and she had a responsibility to him, too. A responsibility that was older and more profound than any duty to her courtroom. To her career, to the law itself. I don't know, she said. And it was the most honest thing she had said in 15 years. I truly don't know. Asterisk, the two words hung in the air between them, small and heavy. I don't know. It was the first time Eleanor Vance had ever admitted to not knowing the answer. Her entire career, her entire adult life, had been built on the foundation of being the person who had the answers. The person who read the law, interpreted the facts, and delivered a verdict. But now, faced with the most important question of her life, her mind was a blank. White wall. Finn just nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. He didn't press her for a plan. He didn't demand a solution. He seemed to understand in a way that felt beyond his years that there was no roadmap for this. They were in uncharted territory, and the only compass they had was the fragile, uncertain connection that had just been forged between them. I should go, Finn said, his voice quiet. He stood up, his movements slow and hesitant. The bubble of their private world was about to burst. The door led back to the courthouse, to the bailiff, to the reporters who were probably already smelling a story. My parents. They'll be wondering where I am. I told them I was going to the library. A fresh wave of something panic, protectiveness, washed over Eleanor. The thought of him walking out of this office, back into the world, felt suddenly unbearable. This messy, painful, complicated situation was hers. And the thought of him having to face it alone was terrifying. Wait, she said, standing up too quickly. She felt a dizzy spell, a rush of blood to her head from the emotional whiplash of the last hour. She put a hand on her desk to steady herself. Don't go out the front. Finn looked at her confused. What do you mean? There's a back way, she said, her mind racing, the legal, strategic part of her brain finally kicking in, not for a case, but for him. For judges, a private elevator that goes to the parking garage. The reporters will be camped out at the main entrance. They won't know to look for you in the garage. Finn followed her without a word, walking down the narrow hallway and into a small private elevator. It was just the two of them, standing in the silent humming box as it descended. The mirrored walls reflected their images back at them. The judge in her black robe, her face pale and tear-streaked, and the boy in his worn-out hoodie looking so young and so lost. They looked like a strange, broken set of matched dolls. Neither of them spoke. They just watched their reflections as the numbers above the door lit up, counting them down to a reality they were both unprepared for. When the doors opened, they were in a quiet, concrete corner of the underground parking garage. The air was cool and smelled of gasoline and damp cement. Eleanor's car, a sensible, dark-colored sedan, was parked in a reserved spot nearby. Do you have a way to get home? She asked. I have a bus pass, he said. She shook her head. No, not today. I'm driving you. It wasn't a request. It was a decision. She was taking control of the one thing she could, getting him home safely. The drive was silent, a heavy, thoughtful silence. Finn stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of color and light. Eleanor kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She was grateful for the focus required to drive, for the simple mechanical task of stopping and turning and signaling. It kept the overwhelming thoughts at bay. She kept glancing over at him, at his profile as he watched the world go by. He was real. He was sitting in her car. She was driving her son home. Do you want to tell me where to go? She asked softly. He gave her the name of his neighborhood, a quiet, tree-lined suburb on the other side of the city. As they drove, they began to talk about small, simple things. The music on the radio, a funny-looking dog they saw walking on the sidewalk, the way the sun was starting to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. It was the kind of normal, everyday conversation that two strangers might have. But for them, it was everything. It was a truce. It was a way of saying, we can do this. We can talk about normal things. When they finally pulled onto a street, Finn pointed to a small brick house with a well-tended garden in the front yard. There was a bicycle lying on the lawn and a colorful wind chime hanging from the porch. It looked like a happy home, the kind of home she had always hoped he would have. Seeing it made her heart ache with a mixture of profound relief and a sharp, piercing sorrow. Eleanor stopped the car a few houses down, not wanting to pull right in front of his house. She turned off the engine, and the silence that fell between them was different now. It was the silence of an ending. For now. "Thank you," Finn said, turning to look at her. "For the ride. And for talking to me." "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For finding me." They sat there for another moment, the words hanging in the air, unspoken but understood. There were so many more things to say, so many questions to ask, so many stories to share. But not today. Today was just for survival. "I should go," he said again, this time with a sense of finality. "Before it gets dark." "Okay," she said. She felt a surge of panic again, the fear of this connection fading the moment he closed the car door. Can I give you my number? Just my cell number, in case you need to. Talk. Or if you just want to no pressure. Just. In case." He nodded, a small smile on his face. He pulled out his phone, and they exchanged numbers, their fingers brushing briefly as he handed her the phone to type in her contact. It was the first time they had touched. The small, fleeting contact sent an electric shock through her, a jolt of recognition and connection that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Okay," he said, putting his phone away. He opened the car door, but then hesitated, one foot on the pavement. He turned back to her. "Eleanor," he said. The sound of her first name, coming from his lips, was the most natural and most shocking thing she had ever heard. "Yes, Finn." "For what it's worth," he said, looking at her with an intensity that belied his years, "I don't think you broke. I think you were just waiting." And then he was gone. He shut the door and walked away, his back straight, his steps confident. He didn't look back. He walked up the sidewalk, past the neighbors' houses, and disappeared through the front door of his home. Eleanor sat in the car, watching the empty space where he had been. Until the streetlights came on and the world around her was bathed in a soft yellow glow. She didn't start the car right away. She just sat there, letting the events of the day wash over her. The disruption in her courtroom, the secret revealed, the tears, the quiet drive, the simple, profound weight of his last words. He thought she was waiting. Maybe he was right. The next morning, the city was buzzing. The story was on the front page of every newspaper, the lead story on every news broadcast. Judge's shocking revelation. Boy interrupts court, claims to be her son. The headlines were sensational, the details speculative. Some stories painted her as a victim, others as a villain. The pundits on television debated the ethics, the personal drama, the impact on her career. But Eleanor wasn't watching the news. She was in her chambers, but the office didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a room where a significant life event had happened. She had spent a sleepless night, not with regret, but with a strange, buzzing sense of possibility. She had thought the end of her secret would be the end of her, but it felt more like a beginning. She picked up her phone and opened her email. She typed a formal, professional letter to the chief administrative judge of the district, informing him that she was immediately and voluntarily recusing herself from all active cases. She cited a sudden and significant personal conflict of interest that would compromise her ability to remain impartial. She didn't give details. She didn't have to. The world already knew. She sent the email before she could change her mind. The moment she hit send, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She was no longer Judge Vance, at least not for now. She was just Eleanor. Later that day, her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. It was just a picture. It was a faded photograph, the one from his wallet, now laid flat on a desk next to a school textbook. Under the photo, Finn had typed a single line of text. Her name is Eleanor. She stared at the message, a slow smile spreading across her face. He wasn't just running from the past. He was embracing it. He was piecing it together. The next few weeks were a strange liminal space. Eleanor took a leave of absence. She stayed in her house, a place that had always been a quiet retreat, but now felt cavernously empty. She didn't read legal briefs. She read novels. She went for walks during the day, noticing things she had never noticed before: the color of the fall leaves, the way the light hit the windows of the houses on her street, She was learning to be a person again, not just a judge. She and Finn started to text. At first it was tentative. A question about a song he liked. A picture of a dog she saw in the park. Then the conversations grew deeper. He told her about his friends, about a tough history test he was worried about. She told him about the mountain she had climbed last summer, about a book she was reading. They were getting to know each other, not as a judge and an abandoned son, but as two people, finding their footing. One Saturday, he asked if she wanted to get coffee. They met in a quiet, neutral place, a small cafe with mismatched chairs and the smell of roasted beans in the air. She was nervous, more nervous than she had ever been before, presiding over a murder trial. But when she saw him walk in, wearing a clean jacket and a hesitant smile, the nervousness melted away, replaced by a warm, rising sense of hope. They sat at a small table in the corner. For 2 hours, they talked. They talked about everything and nothing. They talked about his favorite movies and her least favorite law school professor. They talked about the first time he rode a bike and the first time she won a case. It wasn't about the big, painful secret anymore. It was about building something new, something real, from the rubble of the past as they were leaving. Standing on the sidewalk outside the cafe, Finn looked at her. "You know," he said, "my mom always says that a story isn't really over until you understand the beginning." Eleanor looked at him. At the boy who had crashed into her life and shattered her world, only to help her build a new one. She reached out and for the second time touched him. She put her hand gently on his shoulder. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Then I guess we're just getting started," she said, and in the soft afternoon light, surrounded by the noise and life of the city, a mother and her son began their story. Together,